recognized as a public institution and thus entitling donors to an income tax deduction. The tax authority here in Israel has now canceled exemption for the NGO Physicians for Human Rights. Why now, and what's the reasoning behind it? I'm going to speak now with Ran Cohen, the CEO of Physicians for Human Rights here in Israel. Hi, Ran. Thank you for joining us.
Hi. Hello.
So the threats of this happening has been going on for quite a while. It seems that in the past years, every time they delayed their decision. So it's not a big surprise that they've now decided to do so.
No, it's not a big surprise. We've seen the situation deteriorating in the last 3 years. I must correct and say that we still have tax exemption until the end of June.
Okay.
But according to the tax authority, there are a lot of explanations that we should give before they will renew it, if at all, when mainly their issues or their questions are concerning our activities in the Palestinian territories and our opinions regarding the Palestinian territories and so on.
Okay, let's tackle that point first. I mean, there's opinions on the one hand and activities. Can you give us like a brief overview of what Physicians for Human Rights does in the Palestinian territories?
Yes, well, the first thing we do, and we've been doing it for the last 25 years, we've been operating a mobile clinic which brings volunteer doctors and nurses and other medical staff every weekend to a different village or town in the Palestinian territories, where we provide medical help to Palestinians who are in need. In 2013, we treated a little bit more than 14,000 Palestinian patients. The second thing we do is we provide legal help for patients who need medical care but are unable to receive it because of the fact that the Israeli authorities do not give them a permit either to enter East Jerusalem or to leave Gaza in order to arrive to the West Bank to get medical treatment and so on. So we do quite a lot of work regarding freedom of movement of patients, protection of health workers, which are in many cases are targeted or delayed by the Israeli army and so on. And other activities like seminars and workshops and so on, which basically are aiming to not only to help the Palestinians build their own independent and efficient health system, but also to make sure that the right to health of Palestinians is respected.
The tax authority looks at all the list of all these activities and says, this is all your right to do so, but it's not something that we as a government body can continue to support because it doesn't. It's not compatible with any public objective, quote unquote.
Yes, this is exactly what the tax authorities say. While we say that our opinion is that since Israel is the occupying power and since Israel is in effective control over the West Bank and over Gaza, this is, at least from a human rights perspective and from a human rights point of view, Israel's responsibility to provide the needed services for Palestinians. We are doing that because we believe that this is Israel's responsibility. We are not the only ones who think that this is Israel's responsibility.
Right.
The tax authority says that this is not a public goal, but I think that more than that, what is behind that is the fact that the tax authority, like other governmental institutions, they are not very happy with the work of human rights organizations in Israel, not only us, but other NGOs. And we've seen in the last years attack and delegitimation attack on human rights organizations, attempts to narrow our steps in different legal matters, especially narrowing or taxing foreign funding in 45% and so on.
Ran, you're breaking up a bit. We're going to try to fix our connection. I'm going to ask you another question, see if it does work. You also mentioned that the tax authority is targeting the opinions of the people that work at Physicians for Human Rights, which we're playing devil's advocate here. Let's say they can go along with the activities and provide a legal basis for their decisions. With opinions, it's quite different, and it's a stark contrast to what Western governments usually do when they have a NGO working under their roof.
Well, the Israeli context is a very unique context in which, of course, we are not operating only in the territories. We're also operating in Israel on behalf of Israeli residents and migrants and refugees and so on. But again, we are working in the Palestinian territories because Israel is the power in control over these territories, and therefore Israel legally and internationally and morally have the obligation to respect the human rights of Palestinians. Therefore, we think that our work is legitimate, and not only legitimate, it should be recognized. Now, if the government will not recognize that, well, we will survive. We will continue doing that because this is an ideological matter and not only a matter of funds. We've been doing that much before we were entitled to this tax exemption, and we will continue doing that also now. Mm-hmm. But this is a principal issue. This is a principal issue in which Israel is recognizing for tax exemption purposes other NGOs that work in the territories, that support settlements, that support other activities to expand Israel's control over the West Bank and so on. This is also an issue which is it is politically controversial and so on. But what is controversial to the tax authorities is only our activities and not other activities that actually working to expand the occupation and Israel's support over the West Bank. There are quite a lot of right-wing NGOs that do have this tax exemption status, and they have not been targeted by the tax authorities.
Okay, Ran, I'm going to ask you to stay on the line. I want to speak now with Professor Gerald Steinberg, the director of NGO Monitor. Professor Steinberg, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So in a nutshell, NGO Monitor is an organization that promotes accountability, as you call it, reporting on the output of the international NGO community for the benefit of government policymakers, journalists, and the general public. Meaning your organization looks over these NGOs that Physicians for Human Rights is just one of them and shows distortions, quote unquote?
Well, distortions is one of many aspects that we look at. We look at the funding aspects. NGOs are very important political actors. Let's start with that. Mm-hmm. And in Israel, perhaps more than any other place in the world, there are hundreds of groups that are involved in politics. They get the majority of their money from European governments. Physicians for Human Rights will continue, Israel will continue its activities, whether it gets the approval for giving tax exemptions under the Rule 46, whether it's accepted or not, because most of the money comes from foreign governments, because those governments promote the political position of Physicians for Human Rights and another 50 or 60 groups. But so we look at where this money is coming from. Of course, Mr. Cohen and others will always speak about the wonders of their organization, and that's a good thing. Everybody likes to explain what they're doing. But because this is a very powerful political activity, in any political framework, it's always important to have checks and balances. I mean, that's an important part of democracy. So we provide those checks and balances. The organization that says we provide medical services to this population, and in fact, 80-90% of its activities is going to the United Nations and saying Israel's committing war crimes and Israel's doing terrible things, and these are political, they're incorrect, they're distorting international law. That's our role, and then you and everybody else can decide who's right and who's wrong on this.
Well, Professor Steinberg, what Ran actually was saying about the activities in the Palestinian territories is because Israel is occupying those territories, or it's de facto in charge of the people in there, and physicians such as Ran Cohen and others that work at Physicians for Human Rights work in those territories because they feel responsible to do so, and it's less of a political movement, as you put it.
Well, that's his version of it. But I encourage people to look in detail not only at NGO Monitor's reports on this and another 50 organizations more or less get money from the same places doing the same sorts of things. But look at our information and look at the website and look at the activities that Physicians for Human Rights Israel, and it's important to emphasize they use the term Physicians for Human Rights, which is a global organization, but they are not part of this PHR framework. They are independent. PHR-I does mostly political activities, and some of those activities are extremely damaging. Many of them are based on false allegations. These are not people who have a command of international law, and yet they frequently use them. Even Mr. Cohen talked about international law and obligations, but that's not their expertise. So if they were just doing medical activities, of course, there wouldn't be a problem. The problem is that they claim to be doing medical activities, but they're appearing in UN frameworks condemning Israel, making statements which then are used to justify boycotts and divestment and sanctions and all sorts of other attacks as part of a political warfare process. And that's a good question to ask. Is that legitimate as part of their mandate? By the way, one of the important things that needs to be stated is that the examination by the Rasham Amutot, by the tax authorities of NGOs, is not restricted to so-called left-wing or so-called right-wing organizations.
Yet there is a trend.
The organization Im Tirtzu also had its exemption examined and frozen for similar reasons. So of a contradiction between what they claim to be doing and what's actually being done, or the question about whether there's a contradiction or not.
There is and there's an undeniable almost kind of trend. There was even a file to make into law a transparency of the funding, as you said, of left-wing groups, targeting specifically left-wing groups. Isn't it dangerous as NGO Monitor, as a group yourself monitoring these different groups, to politicize the funding, to politicize the tax authorities' exemptions and non-exemptions? As you said, Im Tirtzu, I don't know that case specifically, but there are many right-wing groups that are operating perhaps with no exemptions at all.
First of all, I think it's very important that the facts get out there, and they're not being controlled by people with very partisan political agendas. So, yes, it is a fact that the tax authorities have looked at what are called right-wing organizations like Im Tirtzu as they look at left-wing organizations and others. The basic issue is not the wing. It's not the political ideology. It's when you apply for a tax exemption, which is a very unique status in a democratic society. It says, unlike other organizations that pay salaries and do activities, we are going to grant you special status because you provide a service. That service can be educational, it can be health, it can be in other areas. But when you claim to be doing a service and that is not, in fact, what you're doing, but you're doing something else, that's a real problem in any democratic society. And so the tax authorities are looking at that, and I think for the first time, seriously, and examining the questions. And from what we can tell, it's across the board. It's pretty even. This is not a political campaign. Now, it's true that in the Knesset there have been some legislation that, in fact, NGO Monitor has opposed because we are not an ideological group, that has been designed to try, but the legislation has been proposed by the right wing of the political process to try to expose and try to curtail the activities of the left, and that legislation has not been approved. In fact, so that shows the democratic process does work.
Right.
So there's always a confusion that's being made for political purpose to say we are targets of this onslaught, and in fact, it needs to be looked at again in more detail.
I want to let Ran Cohen respond. Ran?
Yes, well, just to respond, of course, I think the Professor Steinberg and others would be very happy if Physicians for Human Rights would just do humanitarian work and show the nice face of Israel and how doctors and nurses volunteer to give medical help. But we are not only that, and we are not doing only that because we are a human rights organization. And human rights, in essence, have a lot of political aspects. When you fight for human rights, you fight, in many cases, against the authorities, against the government. And what we are doing is not just providing medical help, but looking at the root causes that bring these patients to us, that create this need for medical help, that create this need for legal help, that leave 20% of the Palestinians without permits of freedom of movement to move from their place to the medical institution and so on, and asking to change that. Our goal is not to continue and giving more and more medical help, but making sure that the government is taking responsibility and that groups like us are not needed anymore. We are, as a group, doing legal work and lobby work, and we publish position papers and reports, and we do not hide our opinions. This is part of being a human rights organization, is to state clearly what the government should do. And of course, in Israel, it's a complex situation, and we should be brave enough to tell to the Israeli government where is it wrong and where is it violating human rights.
Okay.
And when this is not helping, we are doing this also in the UN and other bodies. This is completely legitimate.
Okay, Ran Cohen, CEO. Thank you for joining us. Ran Cohen, the CEO of Physicians for Human Rights, and Professor Gerald Steinberg, the director of NGO Monitor. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.